So then, if you awaken from this illusion,
persistence of vision.
Hello, folks, and welcome to the show. I'm Lance Fever Myers.
And I'm LB Dio.
Hey, LB, did you know that Charles Darwin had all the research and notes ready to write his famous work on Origin of Species long before he published it? See, he knew it was going to be super controversial, right? So he spent 8 years writing a comprehensive work about barnacles first, just to cement his reputation as a serious and thoughtful biologist.
How interesting.
Yes, and like Darwin, I had a very controversial and interesting idea for a book myself, but I didn't study barnacles first. I threw caution to the wind, and I just wrote my damn book. It's called Why So Much, and it's published by Persistence of Vision Publishing. And if you want to buy a copy, you can find it on our website, which is pov-publishing.com, or you can get it on amazon.com.
You mean it's out now? We should celebrate. How about we have a release party at Malvern Books on June 8th?
That's perfect. Malvern Books, June 8th, 2019, for all of those of you who are listening to this way in the future. It's 2019 right now, and June 8th is coming up in about a month. At 7 p.m., we'll have a special guest there, too. Joe Hoppy's going to read some poems, and I'm going to read a little bit from my book and have a book signing and refreshments. So come out. Now, what's going on today?
Well, today we are talking about Darwin and the Barnacle, the great nonfiction work by Rebecca Stott, and we're going to talk about it with none other than Lewis Weil, whom we all know and love as the former boss of Nerd Night Austin and as the owner-proprietor of Money Positive.
What's up, Lewis?
Welcome, Lewis.
Thank you. So good to be here.
So good to have you, by God.
I am excited to talk about barnacles and Darwin.
Yes.
That's so great. And you brought another book about moss, too, right? Moss and barnacles.
Yeah, it was very hard to pick between moss and barnacles won out by a frond.
I wouldn't have guessed that I would be at all interested in finding out what the hell barnacles are all about, but I picked up the book because that's what you chose to talk about, right? And it was super cool.
Thanks a lot, Lewis.
We're going to read this book about these little things in the ocean.
Had you given a thought to a barnacle previously?
Not really.
That was one of the reasons I went with it.
I can understand. That's cool. That's very cool.
Yes, barnacles are, it turns out, very interesting creatures. I believe that zoologists refer to such creatures as animals.
Yes.
And
thank you for saying zoologist. I have been yelled at by zoologists for saying zoology.
Yes, folks, if
they
you're
do
listening
not
at
study
home,
zoos.
do not call zoologists zoologists, or they will dress you down on the carpet.
I'm glad you said it first.
Yes, definitely. But yeah, the thing I notice about zoologists is that they refer to things like fish as animals, which is another thing you got to be careful around, because you look ignorant in front of them if you call a fish instead of an animal. Or something. I'm probably exaggerating slightly, but let's just say I've been deeply traumatized by my experiences with zoologists.
Avoid zoologists if you can.
They are not good people.
That is the lesson I hope everyone gets today.
Yes.
Well, tell us about the book. Let's get into what the whole thing is, the deal with Darwin and the Barnacle.
Okay. This comes from a previous time in my life. Once upon a time, I was a PhD student at the University of Texas in the molecular and cell biology department. And at the time, I thought a good approach to learning about being a scientist would be reading about past scientists and their experiences and maybe gleaning something from how they came, how their careers developed. And a tip to any young budding scientists studying a Victorian scientist might not be the best way to prepare for your career in science.
Well, I'm surprised you would refer to Darwin as a scientist at all, since he was just an atheist trying to trick Christians.
It was a very long game he was playing.
He was very clever.
People do know Darwin, rightfully so, for On the Origin of Species and The Voyage of the Beagle. And I was saving this anecdote, but I'll just drop it right now. Fun fact, I know no scientists who have read Origin of the Species.
I believe it.
I picked it up once. It is a dense Victorian tome. And if you want to read page after page after page about rock pigeons, you can.
So it's not a page turner?
It is not a page turner, unlike Darwin and the Barnacles.
Yes.
I thought I would read it, and it is far too dense, and there is plenty of great writing about evolution and natural selection. However, Darwin, beyond just writing On the Origin of Species, is a fascinating and formidable scientist. And in particular, I thought that this book, I read several books about him, and and I thought it was an interesting story, not just because it's an interesting story about Darwin, which if you read enough about Darwin, you don't mess with Darwin. Everyone, one of his contemporaries who came at him, as they say, ended up losing badly. He was very
Don't come at him.
Yeah, do not come at Darwin. He was very smart and very good at what he did. But it is a fascinating look back on his career that led up to the publication, and just that this creature that we don't even think about, that we might not even think about as a living thing, so shaped his life and thus shaped science and our lives. And
Yes.
I think there's lots of little stories within this book that I have found to be really interesting and fun and important.
And it's also very charmingly written, sort of in an old-fashioned style to go with the time period, in the sense of just having that little bit of style, you know.
Yeah, I agree. I like the, I don't know if you'd necessarily call it historical fiction at all, but it felt like you're reading a work of fiction in a way, because it was telling a story.
It is written like a novel.
Yeah.
Yes.
I did have a chance to email a little bit with the author.
Oh,
Is
you
that
did,
right?
you?
Yeah. I was thinking about getting a tattoo of his barnacle, and I still might.
Wow.
Of Mr. Arthur Balanis, the barnacle that remind me to come back to Mr. Arthur Balanis.
Definitely.
Because it is one of the many fun twists and turns. But I wanted to get a tattoo of this, so I reached out to the author to get a higher quality file so that I could turn it into. In fact, y'all might end up being to blame if I end up getting a permanent thing on my body, because going back and thinking about this book again after a few years has got me wanting that tattoo again.
I'm prepared to accept that blame.
But yeah, it made me think of Cannery Row. Have you read?
Yes,
the story, like them going in the tide pools and finding the little creatures, and like the quaint feeling of like just studying and collecting these things in this time gone by.
What was his friend who worked in Cannery Row? The Log of the Sea of Cortez is another contender for. Is it okay to like look up names while we're here?
Do whatever you want.
Sure.
No,
Sure.
I was asking you because you have a computer.
Oh, you want me to do it?
What's his name?
That's not happening.
All right, this is good radio right here.
This
I'm
is
gonna
good.
reach for my phone because I want to say
Cortez.
the person's name.
I'm looking it up.
Who wrote?
Yeah, we can.
It's none other than, well, it says John Steinbeck.
Well, John Steinbeck wrote it with his friend. Ed Ricketts.
Ed Ricketts.
Ed Ricketts was the naturalist who befriended John Steinbeck, and at the same time I was reading this, I was reading a lot about Ed Ricketts, and he is another. You could argue that perhaps that Darwin, whether you could argue whether he was a scientist or not, he was definitely. You can make the case that he was a naturalist rather than a scientist. He wasn't developing hypotheses and performing experiments. He was studying specimens and speculating.
Right.
So you could argue that he is a naturalist, much in the way that Ed Ricketts, who ran the lab, who ended up building the laboratory that I'm probably wrong, but it might be Scripps Institute in California, this amateur hobbyist who, with Steinbeck, ended up going to the Sea of Cortez and documenting, and ended up inspiring a lot of Steinbeck's writing.
Interesting.
So I don't know. One thing that interests me while yes, I am a biologist, I'm not in the laboratory, and a lot of what I do is more in a developed amateur or hobbyist level. And you could argue that Darwin, one of the most important men of science, had a similar path. He the book starts with his ne'er-do-well childhood, where he didn't focus much on his studies. He was from a prestigious family. In fact, his grandfather Erasmus Darwin, as you would have seen in the book, had an early theory of evolution. This is a good
how
time
is
to
that
mention.
Confusing? There's another Darwin who also had a theory of evolution before Charles
We
Darwin.
wrote a very influential book about it, right?
Yes.
Zoonomia or
Zoonomia.
So that's kind of a misconception that Darwin came up with the theory of evolution. There were lots of theories of evolution bouncing around at the time.
Sure.
And Darwin just happened to
have the guts to
nail
it down, right?
To arrive. There was a lot. People knew that one creature begat another creature, and that over the course of time, we looked at fossils and things changed and adapted, but they didn't know how. One of the prominent theories at the time was Lamarckian evolution, which was that if a blacksmith had developed a big strong arm, that all their progeny would have big strong arms. So what Darwin arrived at was the process of natural selection and the fact that evolution occurs at the population level, not the individual level.
Right.
It's an interesting time period, of course, also, when we talk about whether Darwin was a scientist. It seems absurd because he is the creator of one of the most important scientific theories of all time.
Oh, yeah.
But at the same time, we also have to remember that it was only in the 20th century that the modern scientific method as we understand it today came about. It was only in the 20th century that the idea that you should attempt to form a hypothesis and disprove it was codified as an actual methodology to be pursued. And
we could have a whole podcast series ranting about the scientific method, and
yes,
I think that would be a great series.
Well, they also sort of conflated the two terms of philosopher and natural scientist as well, right?
Well, that's why.
Where it's
That's a
kind
very
of
good point.
They called them natural. They called them natural philosophers as well as scientists in those days, and they were not practicing what we would call the scientific method because it didn't exist yet. I mean, there were people who adumbrated the method, right? Who did try to disprove hypotheses, but it wasn't a system that was understood that you were supposed to follow.
Of hypothesis, experiment, research, null hypothesis controls was not well laid out. And to be honest, even working in science, it's a hard concept to grasp, and a lot of people it's hard to draw conclusions and do experiments, more so than people might realize who've never been in the laboratory. But I think it is fair to call him a scientist. But he was definitely a scientist of his time. Mm-hmm. A lot of scientists at the time were also medical doctors, and so that was the way they made their living. And on the side, their interest in anatomy translated into their interest in the natural world, which comes up a lot in the book. And Charles Darwin was supposed to follow in the steps of Erasmus Darwin and his family and become a doctor, a medical doctor. Ended up not doing well in school, and they trying to decide what to do with this young man who couldn't focus. They sent him into the clergy, and as because the choices were be in the clergy or be a medical doctor for your station in life, which is how he ended up on the Beagle, going around the world, where doing natural history, collecting samples, collecting fossils, which led him to this beach in Chile, where he found a conch shell, and in that conch shell he teased out this tiny, tiny barnacle, and he put it into a little vial, and stored it away. The way they preserved things was they kept specimens in spirits, and he kept hundreds, thousands of spirits on the ship, brought them back with him. He had drafted the first draft of Origin of the Species, but he was a very young man with no reputation, and he stowed it away. And he had been encouraged, as naturalists, as gentlemen were encouraged to do at the time, to pick something and focus on it. And people would focus on flowers, on orchids, on different animals, and write expansive tomes about it. And he chose, because of this odd specimen that he found, to write about barnacles. And this was how he was going to build his experience and build his reputation. And he thought he would knock this out in about a year.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Lewis, but what the hell is a barnacle?
That is a great question. So a barnacle is an animal. It is a little shrimp-like creature. At the time when he was studying, they were thought to be mollusks like clams and oysters. And I don't know if he discovered it or if it was discovered at the time, that they are actually crustaceans, that they are arthropods. Other arthropods include lobsters, crabs, butterflies, centipedes. They are a shrimp-like creature.
The arthropod is a big class.
It is
of
a
animals.
very big class of shelled, hinged animals.
It's incredible that people were ever ignorant enough to think barnacles were mollusks. It's just
Yeah, but they had
hard
a
not to
shell.
Morons.
They had a shell. Total tangent, 100% tangent. There's another excellent book about whales. And it turns out people knew that whales were mammals for hundreds and hundreds of years. It's just that it used to be that everything in the ocean was called a fish.
Yeah.
That just meant it was from the ocean.
Yeah.
So they are a shrimp-like creature that they start their life as free-swimming larvae. And they are fully developed, they have legs, they have a brain, and eventually they find a nice, hard enough surface to settle on, and they secrete a calcareous cement. They cement themselves to their surface, whether that is a rock, a coral, a whale, or a boat. Anything that is hard enough to settle on, and they start to secrete a shell around themselves that is protective, and they eventually their brains dissolve away, and they just become a mouth and a stomach, and they use their feet to filter feed in the water. So if you ever see barnacles that are open, they can completely close their shells. But if you see one open, they will often be pulsing, and that's their feet coming out to grab plankton, which they then shovel into their mouths. And they're highly specific. There are thousands and thousands of barnacles. You can often identify a whale by what barnacles it has, because those types of barnacles only settle on that whale. Those different types of barnacles only settle at different places on a reef or in shallow water. Barnacles are found from pole to pole in oceans, all the way up into briny rivers. They are everywhere from the beach down to the deepest parts of the ocean at hydrothermal vents. They are also remarkable for having the longest penis to body length ratio. Ratio. And that is because once they are fixed in place, the only way for them to mate is for them to feel around with their prodigious member and find somebody to mate with. They are hermaphroditic. They have both male and female reproductive organs, but it is not a good idea generally to self-fertilize, so they will often get in these just barnacle orgies of flailing genitalia, trying to find each other blindly in the sea.
And interestingly, the term hermaphroditic wasn't used by Darwin, right? It was he referred to them as bisexual.
I did not catch on to that.
Yes, he did. He called them bisexual, and why not?
In the deep sea, where it is much more unlikely for you and your thousands of brethren to settle out, oftentimes there'll be one large barnacle, and next to it, another smaller barnacle will settle out so they can mate with each other. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, our listeners, you cannot see my arms performing the act.
A little puppet show, barnacle puppet show.
Basically doing the best barnacle imitation you've ever seen.
But I think on their own, regardless of Darwin and his contributions, they are just fascinating things. And it's good to stop and consider a tiny thing that maybe you hadn't thought about, because it has a story and a life and genetics of its own. So I think they're fascinating without Darwin. But they're extra fascinating with him.
Well, that's one of the things that struck me too is, going to the beach and looking at all the things that just wash up, and you're always going to see something you haven't seen before. It seems from my experience. And it's like you see the craziest stuff, and you're just like, what the heck is that? So there's somebody on Earth who knows what that is. Just to see that to read about these people who, somebody who could walk along the beach and point out and know something about each and every little thing that washes up, and the whole wide variety of life you get there. It's really fascinating to see.
We are very human-centric. The vast majority of life on Earth is not living on land. It's definitely not humans. And what washes up on the beach is a tiny, tiny fraction of what's happening on the vast majority of the planet. So stopping and looking at a barnacle and wondering about its weird little life, it's grounding.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
And it's instructive to study an animal whose brain dissolves and who has a giant penis, because we all meet people like that.
What a life.
Yeah.
What a life. So, I was about to ask a question and you threw me off.
This is
No
what happens
brain,
every
giant
time
penis, right.
I talk with people about
Yes.
barnacles. The giant penis is quite distracting.
Right.
Well, so
We're
do you think that the way that they approached science, and I think you touched on this a little earlier in the show, but the way that they approach science is antiquated to the point where we can't do that the same way?
I really, really appreciate that question, because this is something I think about a lot. That as someone who I work a lot in with sea life in aquaria, I specialize in different things at different times. Right now, I am raising corals with the goal of doing my own experiments, and I've been thinking a lot lately about the role of the semi-professional hobbyist, which is what Darwin really was. He never studied this in the moment. His peers were people that sorry, this is a bit of a tangent. He was able to do his work because it was right when trains and the post was becoming had advanced a lot to where he could write to somebody and have them send fossil samples. And in a similar way, we're in a time now where with the internet, we are able to talk to someone who has our very small specialty. Right. And I participate in a lot of very specific study groups where there's only 7 of us on the planet, but we're able to find each other
Right.
because someone made a chat group about it.
Oh, that's a great point.
And so there is science that is funded by grants, and those grants are very specific and very hard to get, and you spend your life becoming a tenured professor so that you can do your studies. There is science that is done in the name of making a profit in industry, and that does not cover everything. This is a very sophomoric thought I'm having right now, but in that it is not very well developed, in that I have been thinking about this a lot lately. In that way it is sophomoric, that I think there is a large role for a well-informed, educated person who is not affiliated with an institution to be doing studies. There was a fish there was only one of it left. It was extinct in the wild. One zoo had one, and in order to save the species, they reached out to hobbyists to try to find somebody who had one so that they could preserve the species. And this happens a lot in different hobbies, in people who just are obsessed with something and accumulate it. Maybe this shouldn't be so surprising. I ran Nerd Night for 9 years. But no, I do think that there is a role, and I think it's a bit of a lost art. I know that people in academia look down on hobbyists, and people in the hobby think that people in academia are snobs, and that people in industry just care about money, and they're not all wrong. I think that there needs to be, I've been thinking a lot lately, that there needs to be, in the way that some best practices have developed in academia and in industry, there needs to be best practices in the hobby world, to where people are conducting experiments in a proper way and documenting them in a proper way. But I think that there, not only is this a good thing, I think it is necessary. I think it is actually a far larger field than we are supporting through grants or can be supported through a business. So just self-motivated study, I think, is extremely important.
We need a change in the language in a way, because the word amateur didn't always have any negative connotation. It used to be that people proudly refer to themselves as amateurs. Today, if you refer to someone as an amateur, it's almost always meant to be a disparaging remark.
I had no idea that it was anything other than self-deprecating or derogatory.
No, it was simply descriptive. I mean, at one time, people were proud to be amateurs. Yeah, to some extent, it's the way we use hobbyists today. But even that, I mean, if I say I'm a hobbyist astronomer, I'm pretty much implying that I'm not a serious astronomer, but I could be a serious hobbyist astronomer.
I am working on a project to spawn coral in captivity. Coral are animals. They eat and they have sex and they spawn. Coral spawning is going to be very important for the future of reef survival, and people being able to do experiments with millions and millions of larvae. Being able to do it in captivity is going to be extremely important, and I cannot get any academics to reply to me.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. And we should probably remind them that Charles Darwin was himself an amateur scientist. Right?
He was also extraordinarily wealthy, which is why
he was
able to do
wealthy,
right.
hobbyist, amateur, who was one of the most important thinkers in the history of science.
Yeah, and I think it's important. And I encourage people who, if you have the time and the means, to find something and focus on it and study it.
Feels like the idea of like, okay, there's Picassos out there in people's basements. You should go to all of the yard sales you can to try to find them. Sometimes it feels that hard to, I mean, I have certain fields of study that I find fascinating and read books about, but just the very idea of like coming up with something that someone hasn't already covered like it so much further than I could ever dream of. Seems just really, really remote.
There's an infinite number of things to study.
There's a lot of things, there's
you
a
just
lot
have
of
to
things
find
to
something
discover.
that you care enough about.
And there's also not all science has to be
Not all
about
science.
making an original. Not all science is about making original contributions, or innovative contributions necessarily. I mean, there's a lot of taxonomy out there. There's people who just need to find things that nobody's found before, right? It's not necessarily coming up with a brilliant new theory all the time.
No, there's a wonderful app where iNaturalist, where people can document plants and animals that they see in the wild, and it has been an enormous resource because there's millions of people documenting the grasses and bugs that they're seeing.
Well, and
versus how many people can be in the field.
You do hear of it. I mean, quite often, actually.
Yeah.
I can't think of any examples right off the bat, but of amateurs or hobbyists coming at, like, discovering a new type of such and such worm.
Oh
or,
gosh,
like,
there's this fish that was that became incredibly important to science, and it was discovered by a Chinese Boy Scout.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's great. Wasn't graphene one of these things that some hobbyists came up with? And...
I'm sure, but like Darwin, 150 years ago, we were all hobbyists, amateurs, and proud of it.
Yes,
There you
darn right. We're a little close on time, but just to quickly get back to the book, and one thing I definitely felt was that it was a marvelous kind of adventure story. It had a little bit of Patrick O'Brien feel to it. These people were, Darwin and the others were engaged in real adventures on the high seas, living dangerous lives, risking their lives for something that was a lot more interesting, if you think about it, than if they had been going after treasure or something like that.
Oh, absolutely, going and risking life and limb very seriously. People died of diseases and accidents commonly. And to put yourself on a sailboat and go to the other side of the planet to an unknown tropical beach to tease out a barnacle,
I mean,
is quite the adventure.
One of the most fearsome things you can do in a sailing ship is to go around Cape Horn, the southern tip of South America, which is exactly what you have to do to get from England to
tease
Galapagos.
out.
You're absolutely right. That, searching for gold is one thing, but searching for the truth, the origin of life, is a phenomenal goal. And it was interesting to hear little anecdotes about how it affected people personally, like Coldstream, who was pretty much had a nervous breakdown because he was a man of faith.
And the more he learned,
the more
he had a breakdown. He had a nervous breakdown because he couldn't reconcile his faith with what he was seeing under this newly invented microscope.
Yeah. And when you consider the fact that what Darwin eventually did publish really did, even today is still a hot topic in some
We are
places.
recording this in Texas, ladies and gentlemen.
That's right.
That's right. Texas.
Really crazy.
All right. Well, I think we better get to our.
I have.
You do have something.
I have
else.
one tangent that I feel like is perfect to end on. One of the things I love most about this that Mr. Arthur Balanis, the little barnacle that started this whole adventure, that led to him writing, refining his theory and becoming Charles Darwin. Mr. Arthur Balanis turned out to not really be a barnacle at all.
Or a mister.
Was a hermaphrodite? Yes.
That's marvelous. Yeah. Just goes to show you when you pursue these wild little magical adventures, you wind up in strange places.
Mm-hmm. And even Darwin can be wrong.
Yes, even Darwin can be wrong.
Okay, well, so let's on to the lightning round, right? Shall we? And you said you have not prepared.
I have not.
This is a
there might
cold,
be some silence.
Cold approach. Okay, well, fantastic. Here we go.
This is a pass-fail test. You can be.
I'm going to be having dreams
You're
about this for a while.
hearing. You're going to hear answers right off the top of your head. Okay, here we go. When was the first time you remember falling in love with a book?
Oh wow. Probably either in high school reading Ursula K. Le Guin, Left Hand of Darkness, or when
Great
I was
science fiction
7 and read my first Garfield collection.
That's a great answer. That's a great answer. Has a book ever changed your mind about anything?
Wow. Yes, I would say every book does, but no, but's not even a good way to not even a good qualifier. Oftentimes, reading a book, you read thoughts that you had never even considered. So they're not challenging a preconceived notion; they are replacing ignorance. So I would say every book that I've picked up, there is something that has changed my mind in that it added to my mind.
Good answer.
Ooh.
Has a book ever made you cry?
Lewis doesn't cry.
I not to sound. I really don't. Except at random, and unless there's a dog in a movie.
I cry enough for both of us.
Yeah, no, I don't cry that often in real life. I did cry. I have cried watching movies on airplanes. I do remember a tear falling on the page when I read. What was the book? It's not called. Is it called The Good Earth? It's a
Perilous book.
Yeah. I do remember in high
But it was
school.
not your tear. It was someone
It was someone standing over my shoulder. No. I when I cry, I'm proud of my tears. I don't reserve my tears. They just don't come often. But I did. There was something about that book, about watching the family change, the way people were treated, the children, and their interactions with their parents. I do remember, because it was a school copy, and it was now waterwarped.
Oh,
I
that's
do
great.
remember that.
That's great. All right, so name a book that you've read more than once.
Well, Darwin and the Barnacle.
Okay, yes.
I've read Darwin and the Barnacle 2 or 3 times. I've brought another book. Then Professor Elizabeth Warren wrote All Your Worth, a financial planning book that is very formative in my life. I have read now twice. There's a Gathering Moss by Robin Wall Kimmerer. If barnacles are thrilling to you, you'll also be thrilled by moss. And I don't know if it counts as reading multiple times because it is a largely book of pictures. It's a coffee table book, but The Oldest Living Things in the World by Rachel Sussman. I've probably bought 20 copies of this book. I give it to people, and I have looked through it hundreds of times.
Fantastic.
Wonderful.
One more question, and this is the one that always gets everyone. And in that nobody's ever had a good answer so far. Do you have any poetry committed to memory?
I do not.
See, there you go.
Oh no.
The streak remains.
I would have.
The streak remains.
I would have prepared, and it would have been disingenuous.
Yes.
So,
No, I like that. That's
sorry.
fine. That's fine.
I have one committed to memory. It's called The Cow by Ogden Nash, and it goes like this. The cow is of the bovine ilk. One end is moo, the other milk. Thank you.
Brilliant.
That's
Brilliant.
The Cow by Ogden Nash.
Fantastic.
Do you have a suspicious number of rhymes for us?
Oh, yes.
Well, this has been fantastic. I really, really enjoyed talking to you about this book. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Lewis.
This was a delight.
Where can the people catch you out and about?
You'll see me at the North Door at many events.
Excellent. The
Yeah.
North Door, folks. Great
Lots of
venue
events
here in
there.
Austin, Texas. Fever, any other announcements?
Nothing except that my book is now available at Amazon.com. The title is Why So Much by Lance Myers, and the book release is on June 8th at Malvern Books. Come see us.
Excellent place.
Yes.
Great.
Treasure
Really cool.
of a bookstore.
Greatness.
Fantastic.
Thank you, everyone.
See ya.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.